and see where we can look at applying investment opportunities. Talk through what is biodiversity, first of all, and think about how are some of the applications and how we as investors or asset managers can start to factor in nature into financial considerations and business decisions, and fundamentally to apply this in practice. So hopefully today we can move beyond a little bit of the theory that we're seeing in the market and help showcase some of the great tools and measurement systems that are out there in the market to help you start to quantify and formulate biodiversity risk in investment portfolios. If we move to the next slide, please, Damien. Just to give you a bit of a flavor as to who we are at Ogier. Just moving forward, sustainable investment consulting is quite a new business. At Ogier, we've been operating for 2 years. Some of you may know Ogier already. It is a professional services firm where we have 3 pillars: the law firm, corporate business, and consulting business. Sustainable investment consulting, we work primarily with the investment industry, asset owners, managers, and institutional investors to really think about how do you design, integrate, and implement sustainability into portfolios. Our clients are across this complete gamut of asset managers, alternatives, wealth managers and private banks, and also institutional investors, as I say. This is the agenda, the run through. If there's any questions, please do ask them in the chat box throughout. Feel free to raise your hand as well. I want to make this as interactive as possible. We will be opening up the mic towards the end, as Damien says, so get ready for that. We'd also love to ask you questions if that's okay as well. So please get ready for that towards the end of the session. So the first part, let's talk about what is biodiversity. So today, biodiversity in and of itself, I think, has started to achieve quite a wide and differential understanding across the market. While the world's attention has rightly been focused on climate risk and the climate change crisis, there is very much an increased awareness that fundamentally second and a linked crisis to climate change is that of accelerating biodiversity loss. And that has huge significance for society and the future of the human race. It's only back in May 22nd that we obviously celebrated the International Day for Biodiversity. And the key statement that the organisers of this were saying to the market is we now need to move beyond pledges and agreements towards actual action. So each of us today that is a financial institution really has an obligation, be it to look at investment risks in your portfolio around biodiversity and to start to move beyond climate risk and to start to account for those where they are material to the investment strategy. Biodiversity loss in and of itself is actually among the top global risks to society. And we've seen data come through again and again and again. It's only the global risks report data from the World Economic Forum that actually identified biodiversity loss as a top 5 risk factor for the first time in 2020, meaning that more than half of the world's GDP, gross domestic product, accounting for 44 trillion US, is moderately or highly dependent on nature and its services, such as the provision of food, fiber, and fuel. So the planet is now facing, as we know, its 6th mass extinction, with consequences that will affect life on Earth. And this has been proven again with most recent data from the IPCC report. Biodiversity is declining at a rapid rate, faster than at any time in human history. The unprecedented loss of biodiversity places this value at risk, which is nature. It's only recently as well that WWF reported that since 1970, there has been on average almost a 70% decline in the populations of mammals, birds, fish, reptiles, and amphibians. So biodiversity loss is now a critical business risk factor for both financial institutions and corporates. So every one of you today that is joining us from a financial institution or an asset management firm, private equity, I believe each and every one of us does have a role, as I say, to identify biodiversity risk inside of our portfolios and start to think about this from an opportunity side as well in our investment strategies. Spurred on by the recommendations of COP 2015, which we'll get into in a second, governments and policymakers and financial regulators are increasingly focusing on how to align financial flows with the preservation of biodiversity and how to enforce this through ESG regulatory frameworks in the market that currently mainly target climate change. So I think this is an important factor to be aware of as we start to think as investors. It's not only about risk, but also risk from a regulatory perspective and how this may actually, in effect, affect regulations into the future. Moving to the next slide, just to articulate what exactly is biodiversity. So when we think about biodiversity, we should think about nature first. And nature provides, as we know, ecosystem services which benefit businesses and society at large. Fundamentally, the assets that underpin these services, they are called natural capital. And biodiversity, as we know, is the variety of living components that make up that natural capital. As we see it, nature is now the most fertile investment we have. Nature is where we see risk, but it is also where we can see and identify opportunities. In my mind, to date, investors have primarily focused on biodiversity loss due to the acute events, including those linked to illegal activity, for example. Less attention has been paid to how legal business activities are fundamentally reliant on biodiversity to produce goods and services and their contribution towards its decline. So natural assets, just to be clear, these include geology, it includes the soil, it includes air, water, and all living things. It is a form of natural capital that humans derive from a wide range of services. And that is what is called an ecosystem services, which makes up human life and makes human life possible, as we know. But to date, we believe institutional investors have not fully integrated biodiversity into investment decision making processes or assessments of sustainability performance. Now, that's not to say this is an intentional non integration of these issues into portfolios. I believe it's also because we've had market obstacles and challenges in doing so. And we must recognize that and start to build the fabric foundations to move us forward to fundamentally quantify the unit value of a rhino versus the unit value of climate today and other commodities that we can price, for example. So investors need to recognize that biodiversity loss is a systemic risk for portfolios and for beneficiaries and act on that basis to prevent future impacts on the environment, society, and the economy at large. Investors and investees have a role really in shaping those biodiversity outcomes. Just to put all of this in context, there is a report which I'm sure you've come across. It's called The State of Finance for Nature. And I think this is quite a helpful report just to, I suppose, contextualize where we are today in biodiversity and nature and where we're not and where we need to be. So this report, which was released, I think, in 2022 by the State of Nature for Finance, report quantifies public and private finance flows to nature-based solutions, or NBS for short, to tackle global challenges related to biodiversity loss, land degradation, and climate change. So just to be clear here and what we mean by an NBS solution, these are actions to protect, conserve and restore, sustainably use and manage natural or modified terrestrial freshwater systems and marine ecosystems, for example. So what they do is they address the social, economic and environmental challenges while providing human well-being and ecosystem services to society. Today, we can see from this graph that financial flows to NBS solutions or investment opportunities are currently standing at just over 150 billion per year US dollars. So that is less than half of the 384 billion per year investment that we need in NBS solutions by 2025, and only a third of investment needed by 2030 to limit climate change to 1.5 degrees, to stop biodiversity loss and achieve land degradation neutrality. So clearly urgent action and large increases in financial flow are needed for nature, and these are essential. I believe with sufficient finance that these nature-based solutions can provide the means to cost effectively reach climate, biodiversity, and land degradation neutrality targets, for example, particularly if these investments contribute to biodiversity, to climate, and to restoration targets at the same time. So, this double or triple win, which you may have heard about in the nature risk economy right now, is particularly alluring, especially given the current economic situation that we face today. So this is a good report to reflect back on, only released in 2022. If you want to get some fundamental statistics around biodiversity, where we are as an investment industry and a finance industry, and where potential opportunities may lie in the sector. Looking more deeply into what is biodiversity, I've mentioned several terms now. I've mentioned biodiversity, I've mentioned natural capital, ecosystem services. Think of these terms, all as one, and they're often used interchangeably, despite obviously being different concepts and having different definitions. This picture, what I wanted to show here is really the relationship between the different terms that are being described from natural capital towards ecosystem services and to benefits to business and society. We know that biodiversity is vital for a stable ecosystem and to provide stable ecosystem services, and helping to maintain the functioning of a healthy ecosystem and to ensure delivery of a future ecosystem service to the planet. So biodiversity loss and degradation can reduce the quantity, it can reduce the quality and the resilience of those ecosystems, all of which we rely upon as humans, as businesses, and as a society on ecosystem services. So, independent of its direct or indirect value to humankind, biodiversity fundamentally has an intrinsic value. As we've said, it is part of life on Earth, it is part of the fundamental fabric of life on Earth. So, moving forward and thinking about more of the recent topics that you may have seen translated, for example, by standard setting bodies in the industry, such as standards coming out by TCFD and more recently TCFD. Said that backwards, TNFD, which is the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures. So thinking about this and breaking it down into what exactly is the risk here that we're talking about. Nature-related risk is a wider term that encompasses a risk of biodiversity loss and ecosystem degradation, as well as climate-related risk. So these three components are viewed as essential for the assessment of environmental risk, for example. So similar to the Task Force on Climate-related Financial Disclosures, which are the TCFDs, the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosure, TNFD, has been fundamentally set up to help develop recommendations to disclose information about companies' exposure to nature-related risks. And we know that TNFD's main aim is to assist in shifting the global financial system from one that exploits nature to one that supports and nourishes nature. So I just wanted to put this here at the beginning of our presentation so you have in mind what we think about as the wider ecosystem services, how this fits into nature, and some of the risks and one of the frameworks that is being used today to fundamentally articulate what we're meaning when we're talking about nature risk and biodiversity management. Looking a little bit deeper at some of the key drivers of biodiversity loss, what are they? And what are they maybe when we think about this in our investment portfolios and corporates? We do know that biodiversity loss has declined significantly, and species extinction rates are between 100 and 1,000 times greater than historic rates, resulting in loss of vital ecosystem services. Some of these key drivers, they're shown here on this image, and some of those key drivers of biodiversity loss are agricultural activity, for example, over-harvesting through fishing or logging, urban development, energy production, transportation, and associated pollution and climate change having the most significant effect. And these have been broken down quite clearly by TNFD as well into the bottom pillar that you can see on this image, into physical risks, into litigation risks, transition risks, and systemic risks. So this is just a helpful flow chart for you to think about what are some of the key drivers of biodiversity loss, where are they impacting certain sectors. It should be noted, and we'll get into this a bit later when we start to apply some of this theory into a portfolio, how and where these risks change based on the investment strategy that you're operating, the sector that you operate in, for example, they change significantly. So looking forward, what has happened since COP15? I wanted to just showcase some of this because I also find it personally interesting to reflect back on the recent COPs and to see what we've achieved since then. So as you know, COP15, it brought to a close the negotiations for a post-2020 global biodiversity framework, which commits the world to take action by 2030 to halt and reverse biodiversity loss, with a vision of living in harmony with nature by 2050. So what took place at COP15? There was four things to my mind that were fundamentally important to bear in mind. It was the adoption of an equitable and comprehensive fair framework matched by resources needed for implementation. It was the setting of clear targets to address overexploitation, pollution, fragmentation, and unsustainable agricultural practices today in society. We know that those targets that were set in the GBF contain four overarching goals to be achieved by 2050, and those are underpinned by 23 action targets to be achieved by 2030. The third most important thing was it set out a plan that safeguards the rights of Indigenous peoples and recognizes their contributions as stewards of nature. And the fourth point to bear in mind from COP15 was that finance for biodiversity and the alignment of financial flows with nature to drive finances towards sustainable investments and move them away from environmentally harmful ones. So setting these objectives in place, putting pledges in place and moving them fundamentally towards action. So the GBF targets, those will be translated into national level policy through national biodiversity strategies and action plan updates. So if I'm an investor, how should I be thinking about this? Well, taking a step back, investors who want to show leadership in responsible investment today are encouraged to take positive and immediate action to protect nature in line with the GPF protocol. There is a clear investment case to do so. By acting now, I believe investors will manage physical and transition risks more efficiently and effectively related to nature, as well as also seize the opportunities that this market beholds. And that is the market in the shifting economy with positive outcomes on nature. So how do we take some of this theory? We now have an understanding of what we mean by biodiversity, nature risks, some of the pledges that have happened in the market, and some of the frameworks that are setting those targets in place. Well, how can we as an investor now take some of these standards and factor those into how we make investment and or business decisions? First off, why should we take action on biodiversity? I think I've explained it many times and perhaps repeated it myself that biodiversity loss creates risk. There is a reason that I'm repeating this because oftentimes when we work with clients, we're seeing the huge focus just on environmental risk, excluding the biodiversity lens and just zooming into portfolio carbon footprint. It is clear that biodiversity loss creates risk for society and business and therefore our investment portfolios. And that can result in the negative economic and social outcomes. So when we look as consultants at portfolios and investment strategies, we have a keen eye to be looking at biodiversity loss as much as we're looking at climate risk inside of that portfolio as well. I do believe that taking action today on biodiversity loss will present opportunities. But when we look at biodiversity loss in portfolios, what is clear is that the risk exposure to biodiversity, as it does in climate risk, varies across sector, geography, country, investment strategy. And those factors are fundamental to be clear about when we start looking at the fundamental makeup of portfolios and investment strategies, is that risk exposure to biodiversity loss will vary across these segments. So when starting out across these issues, these are some of the key initial areas of conversation that you might be having internally to look across your sectors, look across your countries, look across increased regulation that may be requiring you not just to look at climate risk anymore, but potentially at biodiversity and nature. Think about the operational arrangements of that and how you have potentially an ability to substitute materials in those industries. So for investors, a clear understanding of the potential impact that biodiversity loss might have on a risk return profile of its investees, as well as its overall portfolio, in my view, is critical. And exposure to some sectors may lead to those assets becoming stranded, as we know, if not properly managed. So this is quite a helpful way to think about biodiversity loss and for investors. It's been created by the biodiversity consultancy, and it's called the mitigation hierarchy. Um, and it includes the following steps. So we can see here on the screen the words avoid, minimize, and restore. And what do we mean by that? So investors can seek to drive positive biodiversity outcomes and to reduce negative outcomes by encouraging investees to implement this mitigation hierarchy. What it tries to do is to guide users towards limiting the negative impact on biodiversity from their activities. So the 4 steps, the first one is avoid in red, and avoid negative outcomes from the outset is clearly the preferred option here. Minimize, the second, is about minimizing negative outcomes that cannot be avoided. And the third is around restore in orange. So taking measures to improve or to re-establish degraded or removed ecosystem where impacts could have been avoided or minimized. And then actions for positive outcomes. So only after avoidance, minimization, and restoration have been appropriately and robustly applied can approaches, for example, to compensate for negative impacts actually occur. So these are often referred to as what is called biodiversity offsets, which should only be applied in certain circumstances. So beyond compensation for negative outcomes, actions can actually be undertaken to deliver additional positive outcomes that would have otherwise been achieved. So investors can take this approach and can deliver positive outcomes for biodiversity whilst creating opportunities for value generation in their investee portfolios through enhanced long-term visibility and viability of business models, for example, through cost savings, through increases in operational efficiency, increased market share, development of new business models, and also better stakeholder and shareholder management fundamentally. Moving forward and thinking about how this actually applies in the fundamental building blocks, maybe of what you're used to in ESG today. So investors can act on biodiversity, we believe, in kind of 5 key steps. And these have also been quite clearly set out by the Principles for Responsible Investment. And the first is around creating awareness commitments and initiatives. And one might be, for example, the recent PRI announcement for the Nature Reference Group, which is to build investor capacity for addressing nature and biodiversity loss. So it's basically going to provide a forum for PRI signatories to advance their awareness of nature-related impacts. So if you are actively looking as an investor or as a corporate to set out a way to start your journey on nature, this might be something that you would do internally to start to sign up to these commitments and fundamentally increase knowledge across your institution around nature and biodiversity. The second is obviously and clearly investment allocation, which we'll get into in a second. The third is stewardship, fourth policy, and the last is around meaningful data and how you use that data. So moving forward and thinking about how biodiversity can be included as part of your wider ESG activities that you may be applying today to really shape sustainability outcomes. What I wanted to show here was how that can be applied in ESG integration and also in negative screening. So biodiversity related risks and opportunities, they are assessed through a combination of in-house ESG methodologies today and information from third-party data providers on companies, for example. So when we work with clients, some investors may use what's called SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board's materiality map to identify sectors for which biodiversity may be financially material. So they may see an opportunity for SASB to update this to identify all sectors, for example, with known biodiversity issues that could translate into financial risk. So there is an opportunity actually for SASB to move ahead to do those updates, including across biofuels, apparel, agricultural products. Although some of the standards today mention biodiversity briefly in their frameworks that we may be applying in ESG, the information provided on potential impacts and issue really does lack detail today. In some cases, it's actually missing. So it's not to say that we have a full, complete story on how to implement and apply biodiversity risk and management into portfolios. I think I'm the first to put my hand up and say this is an evolving field, especially in nature and biodiversity. We're coming up with the standards, we're coming up with the measurement strategies that apply to you as investors and portfolios to implement into your approach. And I think that is also symptomatic in the standards being updated at the same time to reflect wider biodiversity and nature related risks into those frameworks and to produce metrics that are relevant as well to investors. But I wanted to give you a quick example verbally of a private equity firm, for example. So if I'm in a private equity firm integrating biodiversity, it can actually be more straightforward compared to listed equity, in my view, as almost all investments involve controlling or influencing or having a minority stake in the underlying company. So therefore, the investor should have better access to information. And here information is gold because this is what we're striving to achieve to monitor and manage any risk from biodiversity to climate to nature. So integration can be more impactful if investors use project-based safeguards, for example, such as the International Finance Corporation Performance Standard, where they have 6 standards on biodiversity conservation and sustainable management of living resources. So if I'm a private equity firm, I may look at those standards to set minimum requirements around biodiversity risk, for example. In other cases, investors have actually increased their technical capacity to better understand and manage biodiversity risk as well. Some private equity funds have developed a focus on a single or multiple biodiversity related issue. For example, AXA investment management, climate and biodiversity funds. But it's not to say that challenges, don't exist. They do. Challenges still exist around biodiversity metrics and data and tracking sustainability performance. But some private equity funds are beginning to see this and create solutions and come around the table really to garner a collective approach actually to how we address and tackle these issues. The second term I'm sure you've all heard of in ESG is negative screening. Well, how does that apply in biodiversity? Today, some investors are also using a negative screen as a filter for biodiversity, and it's could be about excluding companies exposed to biodiversity related controversies. Areas of exclusion, for example, might be commitments to not operating in a ecologically sound site. It might be lack of corporate biodiversity action, for example. So these are just to help break down the fact that biodiversity risk doesn't need to be so theoretical. We can take the approaches that we have today in ESG integration and negative screening and apply some of these mechanisms to start to think about it in our portfolios. So moving forward and thinking about the third pillar, we've gone through awareness, we've now gone through investment allocation, just looking at a high level into ESG integration and to negative screening. And thirdly, I wanted to highlight some of the recent reflections in the market from a stewardship perspective on biodiversity. Stewardship, as we know, is about engagement, and there are a small number of investor engagements that have a specific focus on avoiding or reducing biodiversity impacts. I just wanted to show this example again by AXA, who engaged companies with activities known to impact biodiversity or companies in their portfolio that were most vulnerable, for example, to nature-related risk. This is just an example to help you visualize, what it means to actually engage on biodiversity issues in a portfolio. For AXA, this meant, having dialogue or conversations with over 30 companies over the course of a year to continue to engage with these companies on issues that were presenting when they were doing their biodiversity risk analysis. And they were fundamentally around four factors. It was around management and oversight. So think about it as governance. It was about biodiversity operational impact management. So think about that as the investment integration approach or the management of that across its operations. It was about the lack of transparency on how they were managing biodiversity or not reporting on certain metrics or setting targets, for example. And the last was around the willingness of those companies that they were investing into to actually engage and be responsible or responsive on these topics. So these are, it's just a way for you to think about how does stewardship apply in biodiversity. I may be, as an investor, already engaging with companies depending on my investment strategy on certain topics. It's just to help think through what those might be in a biodiversity risk management approach. But one more slide that I wanted to show before we get into some of the biodiversity measurement approaches today in portfolios is what's happening kind of in the wider market across regulation, investor action, and the wider emerging frameworks that we're seeing. I don't think I need to introduce SFDR and its meaning. Hopefully everybody knows what that means. But just in case, it is European regulation introduced to improve disclosure and transparency in market for sustainable investment products and to prevent greenwashing. So what we've started to see is that the European Union in and of itself is starting to take steps and actions to mandate that products, for example, sold in the EU be deforestation free, and has mapped out actually a plan to protect nature and how it's going to achieve that. This is an important development in my view, because it's now putting, first and foremost and on the table that nature risk is also financial risk when we're starting to see these frameworks come through to spotlight biodiversity. What I'm also seeing is that the rating organizations and standard setters, they're not lagging behind. What we're seeing is CDP, formerly the Climate Disclosure or Climate Disclosure Project. They've added actually new questions, 7 new questions into their survey focused on biodiversity. Also, the Global Reporting Initiative (GRI) has also done major work in recent years to increase the biodiversity targets and focus on metrics in its framework. We also have the SBTN, the Science-Based Targets for Nature, developing a framework for biodiversity targets. And I've mentioned briefly earlier, obviously we have the TNFD and the framework around that. So my point here is that the market has moved beyond climate risk and it is looking at biodiversity risk. The regulations are starting to ingest that and inhale it and be updated. And I think we're also starting to see the measurement mechanisms being implemented to deliver on those goals as well. So this is a good market development in my view. One question that we do get is, well, how does biodiversity play out in the SFDR and which indicator is it that actualizes biodiversity? It is PAI indicator number 7, principal adverse indicator. And that indicator obviously looks at any negative activities affecting biodiversity sensitive areas. So the shift in focus to biodiversity, in my view, from the global regulatory regimes and policy standpoint, means that asset managers and companies will be under increased pressure, in my view, to manage and to monitor and manage biodiversity related risk. I think for asset managers, there's an elevated client focus as well. We've started to see our clients, asset managers, increasingly get questions from a biodiversity nature perspective. And we're also seeing from the corporate assets perspective as well. Obviously, there's increased non-physical risks being elevated across a increased number of jurisdictions. So this is not only a European issue, it's a global issue. It's happening in APAC, US, and Europe. And all continents, I should say. Moving to the final section. So part C, I wanted to briefly take you through here before we get to the Q&A. What are some of the frameworks? How do I take everything that you said here today, Leonie, and apply that into my portfolio? There's no one answer to this, so forgive me if we haven't managed to articulate that in a few clean slides. But how should I get started? You may have noticed I've put pictures of animals as we go throughout here because I recognize as well that we've also been talking quite heavily about loss of biodiversity. I think also we need to be thinking positive in terms of nature as well. And I do fundamentally believe there's positive opportunities for us as investors and corporates to alleviate some of these challenges and to work towards solutions. But how do we get started? Even if I'm a bank, even if I'm a private equity firm, or maybe I'm a family office thinking about where do I get started in applying biodiversity risk and opportunities to my portfolio? It always starts with policy, in my view. It always starts with commitments. It always starts with a conversation. So thinking about establishing a policy and how that applies as a strategy into your institution is the first and foremost step. I think what I'm seeing is that proactive institutional investors, they've already started to take action on biodiversity across their investment activities, despite these barriers that I've mentioned for the past 30 minutes. Their actions actually highlight how biodiversity focused ESG incorporation and assessments of sustainability performance could actually be scaled up. In my view, beyond the policy and setting the strategy and the setting how you're going to assess and manage impact, it is fundamentally about the allocation of finances. And how do you do that? How do you adapt your portfolio to be, not only future proofed against temperature, but also future proofed against biodiversity and nature risk? And how do you engage with the investees to improve those outcomes for your portfolios? Quite obviously, it's about avoiding and reducing harm, but it is also about financing the just transition to a nature positive economy. And I believe investors should start to think about how they allocate capital to sectors, across sectors, or business models which you're investing into, which are avoiding and reducing biodiversity loss and increasing opportunities for positive outcomes on the ground. For example, including restoration. Investors, in my mind, need to assess and understand their existing and potential risk exposure to biodiversity loss and their role in shaping the biodiversity outcome in portfolio construction so that the fund is designed in a way that the fund thesis can deliver upon those KPIs or the PAIs or binding characteristics that you may have set out in your SFDR commitments. So that might include, for example, mapping sector risks and impacts associated with the loss of and dependencies on biodiversity. It might include setting a target, a science-based target for managing biodiversity, as well as having an understanding of how the accumulation, for example, of legal activities contributes to the decline of biodiversity. I believe it is also fundamentally about engagement, as much as it is and will always be engagement for ESG. It is engaging investees. Investors should engage companies on reducing negative biodiversity outcomes and design stewardship approaches to deliver positive outcomes. I believe the engagement should prioritize high risk sectors, so those that have high dependency on or high impact on biodiversity, for example. In addition, maybe investors can also explore the potential to engage with sovereign issuers to understand how they measure and monitor natural capital. And to facilitate this engagement, investors need to develop expectation on also what constitutes good practice. What is it that you're striving towards here? Before we get bogged down in the measurement, let's think about the big picture for your institution. What are the fundamental vision, the target, the fund thesis that you're looking to achieve, and the philosophy behind that is just as important as the underlying nuts and bolts to deliver it. Moving on and thinking about where we are today in terms of biodiversity measurement, I do believe there's been a lot more scientific focus towards robust approaches towards biodiversity measurement. Um, We're also seeing that biodiversity is getting aligned with global indicators, with some of the standards that I've mentioned earlier, like GRI, CDP, for example. We're also seeing the recognition that the one and only biodiversity indicator does not exist. There is no one silver bullet in a portfolio to measure biodiversity risk. This is hard work. It is hard work to try and think about not just climate risk and biodiversity, but to break it down by sector and to start to think about how and what is practical for you as an investor or portfolio manager and how that can be applied to measure biodiversity and nature risk proactively. I think the market is also moving towards a combination of smart tools. There is no one data provider. You know, there is no the holy grail data provider that I can recommend you to identify and monitor your KPIs behind biodiversity. I believe it's going to be a combination of tools to do so. Measurement is one thing. It's great to have the measurement approach, but it's the data collection and fundamentally the stakeholder engagement and your own analysis of this, I believe, that sets you apart as investors. It's the additional fundamental layer of your research analysts and their own reflections and views and opinions on top of this data that I believe will set you apart in investment portfolios when you may be thinking about building maybe future biodiversity related funds or maybe the Rhino Impact Bond number 2. Please do it. You know, this is what we need in the market. We need more innovation. We need more investment opportunities and pipeline from the institutions, from asset managers. So the measurement aspect is only one thing. I believe there is huge opportunity here on the investment pipeline side to navigate what the data is telling us and to create new ways of thinking about it as well to invest into pipeline opportunities. I think one of the other areas that we're also seeing, not just in nature, but in wider sustainability as well, is the ability and hopefully the move towards natural capital accounting approaches, where we can start to quantify and measure from an accounting perspective the value of these factors. What are some of the tools today that we have? Those tools have been broken down here by portfolio and company level. So the first thing that I wanted to say here, when you think about, conducting, maybe setting your policy strategy, thinking about the engagement tactics and investment allocation that we went through, it's also about how does this apply at the portfolio and the company level? And how can you think about biodiversity risk across these two dimensions? I've said earlier that not all sectors are equally exposed to biodiversity risks, and the location, the investment strategy, the asset class type, all implements or impacts the associated risk. I also see that often much of the risk exists within the supply chain or the product side. So getting down at the company level and analyzing, sector specific risks is also important. What we've also started to see is the understanding of opportunity is much less well developed. For example, in this space, there's been even a lot of focus on what I've said to you today. The amount of times I've said the word risk versus the amount of times I've said the word opportunity is also a reflection here that there's an understanding really that the opportunity side of biodiversity is less well understood. But I think that's where we're getting stronger as a market day to day to try and account for and identify those opportunities. But we do know that data is often not fit for purpose within biodiversity management. One of the things I want you to take away from this is that biodiversity is location specific and varies according to the actual asset class and location. So therefore, there can be actual challenges to aggregate that biodiversity data at an enterprise level. That is a major challenge for sectors which have extended complex natural resource-based supply chains, for example. So I think an understanding of geographic risk is important if a true representation of biodiversity risk and opportunity is to be identified. Some of the tools to enable this assessment, I believe, are in development. And one of the examples I wanted to give was 91, obviously formerly Investec, and WWF. And they highlighted the potential for spatial finance, which is the combination of geospatial data Earth observation data and satellite data to actually address some of these issues and gaps. So some of those approaches could be used to analyze systemic biodiversity risk as well. And just looking at some of the questions as they come in as well. So let me try and answer those. I'll have a read. Sorry. Finley, in your opinion, who are the trailblazers when it comes to integrating biodiversity into asset practice? You've beat me to it. One of my slides does have a case study, so let me get to that one and we'll go through. I think fundamentally there are no trailblazers yet. This market is very much still in development. So I think approaches that have come out are very much in whip. Regarding the biodiversity WEF, I'll come back to that one, Alex, in a second. But I wanted to get through the portfolio level measurement approaches and actually show you guys some of the tools that are being used today. I think in my mind, these are the trailblazers. The trailblazers are the scientists that are creating the solutions and the tools and translating those into financial language to help the financial system actually take on board these risks. And some of those trailblazers has been the biodiversity footprinting approaches that have been issued. This report that I show on the screen was actually released by Finance for Biodiversity. It's a very helpful report if you want to get a good download on the multiple different biodiversity measurement approaches that exist today in the market. We've broken them down here into three fundamental approaches. First, when you think about how do I measure biodiversity, think about footprinting. Secondly, think about extinction risk. And third, think about dependency. Now think about all of the different frameworks that are in the market and tools, and they fundamentally fall into those three categories. Some of the standout biodiversity footprinting approaches that the market has been using, including in corporates and financial institutions, include the corporate biodiversity footprinting, or CBF for short. Also the biodiversity footprint financial institutions, BFFI, and also BIA, the Biodiversity Impact Analytics. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go through everything one by one. I do want to spend some time going through Encore, which is the Exploring Natural Capital Opportunities today. So moving to this slide. So what is Encore? Encore, sorry, let me just go back one screen. Remember, this is about dependencies here. So Encore is a tool for exploring natural capital opportunities and risks exposure. What it fundamentally does is it enables users to actually visualize how the economy depends on nature and how environmental change creates risks for businesses and investors. So starting from a business sector or ecosystem service, for example, or natural capital asset, Encore can actually be used to start exploring natural capital risks. ING have actually used this and joined a pilot to test Encore for its whole portfolio level analysis. Getting into it in a bit deeper and exploring Encore. So it's a web-based solution. This is just a visualization of what it looks like on the screen. So as I say, it's to help financial institutions such as ING and others, and other global banks, investors, and insurance firms start to assess the risks that environmental degradation, such as pollution of oceans or destruction of forests, can cause, and the potential impact onto the associated portfolio. Right now, I believe it's actually being further developed to enable tracking of investor biodiversity commitments. So the tool is very valuable in my mind to assess the overall risk exposure to natural capital externalities. It does not yet have a tailored risk report or asset level data, so making it a starting point for understanding risk exposure. It's a good starting point for that. Encore is building out its approach to help financial institutions answer three questions fundamentally. How am I influencing as a investor biodiversity through my investment or lending activity or portfolio? Am I harming or building the resilience of biodiversity with my investments? And is my portfolio in alignment with global or regional biodiversity targets? And how much so is it in alignment? One of the important things that the tool does is obviously also exploring hot spots, which is the bottom graph that you can see on the right hand side. So hotspots of natural capital depletion mapped against my investment portfolio, mapping out dependencies and impacts of business activities by exploring and leveraging spatial data. I want to go through a case study. This is a fictional case study, and actually it's been also shaped by PRI. So it is a case study of how it's been applied in practice by a manager and what they were doing for a global listed equity portfolio to take some of the things today that I said and break it down into 4 key steps of how do I get started. So this asset manager is global in nature, as I say. It's a listed equity portfolio. What was this asset manager's challenge? Well, they were looking to consider expanding investments in food consumer good companies. So they held food retailers, food manufacturers, for example, and agri companies, including soy traders in its portfolio. The asset manager itself was committed to responsible investment. It's a PRI signatory, and they had been looking to incorporate ESG risks into its corporate engagement and investment analysis for some time. So, through its exposure in the food sector, this manager was concerned about the potential dependencies and impacts of arable crops, for example, such as soy, and their role in corporate supply chains. So they wanted to better understand the natural capital risks associated with soy production and its sourcing locations, and to identify potential opportunities to reduce its investment portfolio risk exposure and impacts on the ecosystem services. So how did they do it? They started with first using Encore, and they used Encore to identify dependencies and impact drivers. So they identified the natural capital dependencies associated with agricultural products such as soy and other large-scale irrigated arable crops in its portfolio. Secondly, what they did was look at identifying sourcing locations for soy production. So you can see here on your screen, the bottom picture on the right-hand side. This is a tool called TRESI, which stands for the Transparency for Sustainable Economics tool. So via this tool, the ESG data providers and engagement with investees, the manager was actually able to identify soy sourcing locations for its company's portfolio. So you can see already in the first 2 steps, this manager has used 2 different tools, and now they're moving to the third steps. Well, taking that information, how do I identify the hotspots and natural capital depletion? So through Encore again, the manager was able to go back and identify where natural capital depletion might be occurring. So, for example, they found hotspots of soil and sediment depletion in the Amazon basin that were present in its portfolio. And then its last step was about comparing company location sourcing with natural capital hotspots of depletion. So how did they do that? They actually compared company sourcing location data with a map of the natural capital depletion zones. So using these 4 steps and all of the information that they were able to capture, they refined the engagement strategy with their underlying portfolio companies in their portfolio to engage those investees with exposure to this Brazilian soy, and they engaged in both direct and indirect engagement. So when we spoke about stewardship earlier, so this was the first tools they used to identify where there were kind of red flags in the portfolio. They then got armed with more information around the specific locations of that challenge, so that they could engage the underlying portfolio companies through direct and indirect engagement or stewardship. And that was about encouraging these companies to adopt international best practices. Maybe, for example, they might recommend the standard for responsible soy production, and maybe, as I said earlier, the IFC performance standards were going to be recommended by this manager. I'm running through this so you can get an idea of how a lot of these terms, approaches, and practices in the ESG can actually be applied in a case like this. And then at the company level, this is quite similar in a way to the portfolio analysis that I've just taken you through, but I wanted you to understand, what are some of the parameters that when you look at the portfolios, in addition to what I've said, that you could help determine biodiversity risk in the portfolio. Obviously, looking at the nature of the sector, the country, and the nature of the operations is important. Looking at the company location is important, and this tool Trezi helps you do that. Looking at the quality of company management. ZSL, the Zoological Society of London, created SPOT, which is the Sustainable Palm Oil Transparency Toolkit, which you can use to look at the company engagement on these issues, and also looking at the company's actual impacts and outcomes. So if you reflect back earlier, some of the points on engagement I was making was how responsive were these companies towards, recommendations that the investors were making to them. That's important also, and can be reflected in some of the systems today that we have around global biodiversity scoring. So summarizing a lot of these initiatives that I've mentioned have been very well defined and articulated already in this paper by the Finance for Biodiversity. So what you see here on screen here are all of the different biodiversity measurement tools and standards that are available today, and whom they are applicable to across banks, insurers, corporates, investors, for example. So I would recommend for anyone who's looking to kind of get a better handle on a lot of the things I said today to jump into that after for further reading. In conclusion, we've said a lot, but what would we walk away with from this session today on biodiversity is that establishing a policy and strategy is first and foremost fundamental. Assessing your impacts and dependencies and acting to reduce them is critical. Allocating finance is critical. We've seen from the Nature for Finance report the financing gap that exists today. In my mind, any gap presents an opportunity. And we need to start to visualize what those are as investors as we think about, future-proofing our portfolios as well. Setting targets in line with global goals is important. And thinking about how does maybe the CBD post 2020 GBF framework apply to me as a business, as a bank, etc., and how can I take some of these approaches? And then moving towards measurement and disclosure of nature-related risks. I do believe that this industry needs increased collaboration, engagement, and influence. It is an industry where there's no silver bullet, as I say. So I think I'm seeing a lot more working groups come together, like the one that I mentioned by PRI. I think participate in those and learn from your peers in the field as well. I'm going to pause there because I think we've had a few more questions come in as well, that maybe I'll give the floor back to you, Damien.